The Nexus station had the aesthetic appeal of a rusty knife and the charm of a tax audit. Built around the corpse of a star that had given up on existence roughly 3 billion years ago, it served as the galaxy's premier destination for those who had burned their bridges everywhere else. Pirates who'd grown too ambitious for their own good, diplomats whose careers had taken unfortunate turns, researchers whose experiments had gone spectacularly wrong. They all ended up here, orbiting a dead sun and pretending their lives hadn't become cosmic punchlines. Station Commander Vexthul had 6 arms, which most days felt like 4 too few for the amount of bureaucratic nonsense he had to juggle. The Karathi had evolved multiple limbs for hunting in dense forests, but evolution had clearly never anticipated forms requesting docking privileges at 2 a.m. station time. "Another transport requesting berth 47, announced Ops Coordinator Jik, her crystalline features reflecting the bridge's emergency lighting with typical silicate pessimism. Claims they're carrying a single passenger with diplomatic immunity. Vexthul's primary arms continued their eternal dance across his workstation, while his secondary pair reached for the caffeine substitute that passed for survival juice in this corner of nowhere. Let me guess. Another Terran who thinks their species' recent admission to the Galactic Cooperative means they can demand 5-star accommodations on a station held together by spite and recycled atmosphere. Actually, sir, the passenger manifest is interesting." The way Jik said interesting carried the same tone most species reserved for discussing explosive decompression. Vexthul's tertiary arms paused their sorting of reports about malfunctioning gravity generators and suspicious sounds in the lower decks. Define interesting. Are we talking mildly fascinating research project, interesting, or evacuate 3 sectors and pray to whatever deity handles cosmic insurance claims, interesting? The passenger is listed as Dr. Elena Vasquez, Department of Anomalous Phenomena, Earth Collective. Her clearance codes are... Jik's voice trailed off as she processed the information streaming across her workstation. "Sir, her clearance codes are higher than yours." This was concerning for several reasons, not least of which was that Vexthul's clearance allowed him to requisition small moons if the paperwork was filed correctly. He'd never actually done so, but the theoretical possibility had always been comforting during particularly stressful budget meetings. "Department of what now?" "Anomalous Phenomena. Earth Collective Registry shows it as a subdivision of their, let me translate this properly, Department of Really Weird Stuff that probably shouldn't exist but does anyway." Vexthul had dealt with human bureaucracy before. Their talent for creating departments with aggressively mundane names that handled absolutely insane responsibilities was becoming legendary. The Department of Interspecies Relations, for example, was run by a woman who'd apparently negotiated a peace treaty with a sentient black hole by challenging it to poker. "Fine. Clear them for docking. Standard quarantine protocols. If she starts exhibiting any of the usual human symptoms, excessive optimism, casual disregard for physics, or the disturbing tendency to befriend things that want to eat them, we go to yellow alert." The transport that docked an hour later looked like someone had taken a perfectly respectable freight hauler and decided it needed more armor plating, stranger sensor arrays, and what appeared to be ritual symbols welded onto the hull. Either humans had developed an inexplicable fondness for abstract art, or this particular ship had been designed by someone who took cosmic horror very, very seriously. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged from the airlock wearing a smile that somehow managed to be both genuinely warm and faintly unsettling. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that suggested she'd seen things most sentients would require therapy to forget. Her clothing was standard-issue human diplomatic attire, which meant it looked simultaneously professional and ready for combat. "Commander Vexthul?" Her accent carried hints of what databases suggested was an Earth region called Mexico, though her basic was flawless. Thank you for accommodating the short notice. I know stations like yours usually prefer advance warning when dealing with specialized consultations. The way she said specialized consultations made Vexthul's secondary stomachs clench. In his experience, humans who smiled while discussing their work were either selling something or about to explain why large sections of spacetime might need to be cordoned off for public safety. Dr. Vasquez, your requisition mentioned consultation services, but the details were somewhat vague. Well, Commander, specificity can be challenging when discussing phenomena that technically don't exist according to most species' understanding of reality. Your station has been experiencing some irregularities, hasn't it? Unusual sounds in uninhabited sections, crew reports of shadows moving independently of light sources, equipment malfunctioning in ways that suggest deliberate interference rather than standard mechanical failure. Vexthul's primary arms stilled. The incidents she'd described weren't in any official reports. They'd been carefully omitted from documentation, dismissed as stress-related hallucinations, or attributed to the station's aging infrastructure. The fact that a human consultant arriving from halfway across the galaxy could summarize their problems with casual accuracy was deeply troubling. How exactly did you— Oh, Commander, patterns like these have signatures. My department specializes in recognizing them. Elena's smile widened slightly. Think of us as cosmic pest control with advanced degrees. In the station's lower levels, something that shouldn't have been listening began to pay very close attention to the conversation. It had been feeding quietly on the ambient fear and confusion of the station's inhabitants for months, growing stronger with each unexplained incident and dismissed report. The arrival of new prey had initially seemed promising. Humans were wonderfully complex in their emotions, full of delicious anxieties and existential dreads. But this human was different. This human smelled of things that had once been cosmic predators and were now filing incident reports. This human carried the psychic residue of entities that had learned to schedule appointments rather than manifest dramatically in the dead of space night. For the first time in its multidimensional existence, the thing in the lower levels began to experience something uncomfortably similar to performance anxiety. Your reputation precedes you, Dr. Vasquez, Vexthul said carefully, though I admit our databases contain very little information about your specific field of expertise. That's intentional, Commander. Official records tend to make some of our clients nervous. They prefer informal arrangements, less paperwork, fewer awkward questions from oversight committees who'd rather not know the details. Elena adjusted the shoulder strap of what looked like a standard diplomatic case, but hummed with barely contained energy. Shall we discuss the specifics of your situation? I find these conversations go more smoothly when everyone involved can speak candidly about impossible things. Vexthul had survived 3 decades of station management by developing a finely tuned sense of when situations were about to spiral beyond his pay grade. That sense was currently screaming at volumes that threatened to damage his auditory organs. But the alternative was continuing to file reports that carefully didn't mention the growing list of incidents threatening his crew's sanity, and that approach was proving spectacularly unsuccessful. Very well, Doctor. Let's discuss impossible things. Conference Room Delta 7 had been designed by committee, which explained why it managed to be simultaneously claustrophobic and cavernous. The table could seat representatives from 12 different species, though getting them to agree on basic concepts like up and the passage of time remained an ongoing diplomatic challenge. Today's gathering was smaller than usual, but considerably more nervous. Ambassador Cathari of the Zelani Collective kept her photosynthetic skin patches carefully covered, a sign of extreme anxiety among her people. The Quillian representative, trade coordinator Nixavel, had arranged his ceremonial quills in what Elena's cultural briefings suggested was a defensive pattern. Most telling of all, Hegemony Liaison Tormund actually sat in the same chair twice in a row, abandoning his species. Compulsive need to sample every available seating option. "Gentlemen, lady," Elena began, settling into her chair with the easy confidence of someone who held meetings in impossible places on a regular basis. "I understand you've been experiencing some operational difficulties." Cathari's skin patches flickered despite their coverings. "Dr. Vasquez, we appreciate your willingness to review our situation. But I must ask, your Department of Anomalous Phenomena, exactly what qualifications does this require?" "Advanced degrees in theoretical xenobiology, certification in multidimensional threat assessment, and a surprisingly thorough grounding in customer service principles." Elena opened her case and withdrew a tablet that cast no reflection in the conference table's polished surface. "Also, a willingness to work nights, weekends, and in locations where normal physics goes to die." Trade Coordinator Nixavel's quills rattled with what might have been laughter or existential terror. "Customer service? Oh yes. Turns out most entities causing what you'd call supernatural disturbances are really just poorly socialized apex predators with communication issues. Set clear boundaries, establish mutually beneficial arrangements, file the proper interdimensional paperwork. Works wonderfully most of the time. Hegemony Liaison." Tormund leaned forward, his artificially enhanced features betraying more interest than his diplomatic training probably recommended. "Most of the time?" Elena's smile acquired a professional edge. "Well, some entities are genuinely malicious rather than simply misunderstood. Those require different protocols, much more direct intervention." The room fell silent except for the ambient hum of life support systems and what might have been distant screaming from several decks below. Everyone pretended not to notice the second sound. "Perhaps," Cathari said carefully, "we should begin with specifics. The Zelani Collective has been experiencing losses. Mining crews in the Outer Rim report encounters with what they describe as living shadows. These phenomena consume light sources, drain power cells, and leave behind only empty equipment and recordings of crew members speaking in languages that predate our civilization." Elena nodded and made notes on her impossible tablet. "Shadow feeders, classic symptoms. Have the consumed crew members attempted to make contact since their disappearance?" What?" Shadow feeders rarely actually consume biological matter. They're usually just relocating people to pocket dimensions that better suit their environmental needs. Your missing crews are probably fine, just understandably confused about their sudden change in housing arrangements. Trade Coordinator. Nixavel's defensive quill arrangement relaxed slightly. "You speak as though you've encountered these entities before." "Twice last quarter. Once in the Centauri trade zone. Misunderstanding about territorial boundaries, and again near the Horsehead Nebula. That one was actually a jurisdictional dispute. Turned out 3 different species of shadow feeders were claiming the same system, and they were taking their frustrations out on passing cargo ships." "How did you resolve it?" Elena's expression suggested this was the kind of question that required charts, presentations, and probably a disclaimer about the psychological well-being of anyone who learned the full details. "Mediation, lots of paperwork, a surprisingly reasonable custody-sharing agreement regarding feeding territories. Oh, and we had to relocate about 1,500 accidentally abducted sentients, but that's fairly standard for territorial disputes." Hegemony Liaison. Tormund cleared his throat, producing a sound like grinding metal. "Our situation may be somewhat more complex. Deep space construction projects have been reporting reality distortions, geometric impossibilities, Structures that contain more internal space than their external dimensions allow. Work crews describe rooms that exist only when observed directly, and corridors that lead to locations several parsecs away from the construction site. Ah. Elena's stylus paused over her tablet. Architecture class reality manipulators. Those are trickier. What's the project scope? Orbital manufacturing platforms. Class 7 industrial capacity. We're attempting to construct them in previously uninhabited systems. Previously uninhabited by whom? The question hung in the air, like a particularly unpleasant smell. Tormund's enhanced features processed several expressions before settling on something that might charitably be called chagrin. By anyone, according to our surveys. And what survey methods did you use to detect non-corporeal intelligence? I'm sorry? Elena set down her stylus and regarded the hegemony representative with the patient expression of someone explaining fire safety to enthusiastic arsonists. Architecture class manipulators don't typically manifest unless their nesting sites are being disturbed. Your construction projects are probably being built on top of their homes. They're not attacking your crews, they're redecorating. Trade coordinator Nixivel's quills had progressed from defensive positioning to what Elena's briefings suggested indicated acute professional embarrassment. Dr. Vasquez, the Quillian Commonwealth has been experiencing disruptions to our primary trade routes. Ships report navigation systems leading them to destinations that don't appear on any star charts. These locations exist for the duration of the visit, but cannot be relocated on subsequent journeys. Tourist traps. I beg your pardon? Interdimensional tourist traps, usually run by entities who find conventional economic systems amusing, but don't quite grasp the concept of repeat customers. Your ships are probably being offered exotic goods or services in exchange for... Elena consulted her tablet. What do Quillians typically carry that might interest non-corporeal merchants? Art, cultural artifacts, historical recordings? Perfect. They're collecting. Elena made more notes. Completely harmless, but they're probably violating several dozen commercial shipping regulations without realizing it. We can set up proper trade agreements, establish regular contact protocols, maybe work out a licensing system for the interdimensional commerce. Ambassador Cathari's skin patches were now flickering in rapid, anxious patterns. Dr. Vasquez, you speak of these entities as though they were simply unusual business partners rather than existential threats to galactic civilization. Elena looked up from her tablet with genuine surprise. Well, yes, that's exactly what they are. Most anomalous phenomena are just environmental factors that nobody bothered to study properly, like cosmic weather patterns, really, except with more personality and better lawyers. Better lawyers. Oh, you'd be amazed how litigious some interdimensional entities can be. Last year we had to settle a class action lawsuit filed by a collective of displaced quantum intelligences who claimed the Galactic Cooperative's expansion policies violated their mineral rights to 17 star systems. The silence that followed this statement was the kind typically reserved for revelations that reality was significantly stranger and more bureaucratic than anyone had previously imagined. Dr. Vasquez? Commander Vexthul's voice came through the conference room's communication system, carrying a tone that suggested he'd prefer to be dealing with standard pirate attacks or reactor meltdowns. We have a developing situation in Section C. The irregularities are becoming more pronounced. Elena closed her tablet and stood, somehow managing to convey both professional competence and barely contained enthusiasm. Gentlemen, lady, looks like we're moving from consultation to active demonstration, shall we? Section C had apparently decided that conventional reality was more of a suggestion than a requirement. The corridor stretched ahead of them for what should have been 30 meters, but felt like 30 kilometers, while simultaneously seeming to curve back on itself in ways that made several species' inner ears file formal complaints with their respective nervous systems. Elena walked through the dimensional distortion like someone navigating a particularly crowded marketplace, occasionally pausing to examine flickering patches of wall where normal matter was having philosophical disagreements with whatever was trying to replace it. Classic manifestation pattern, she observed, pulling what looked like a modified tricorder from her kit. The device hummed with frequencies that made Cathari's photosynthetic patches try to hide deeper under their coverings. Single-point intrusion, localized reality drift, progressive expansion into adjacent spaces. Textbook haunting behavior. Haunting? Commander Vexthul's voice carried the weary tone of someone whose day had already exceeded his capacity for existential confusion. Are you suggesting our station is being haunted? Oh, definitely. Though haunted is something of a misnomer. These entities aren't deceased in any sense your species would recognize. They're just dimensionally displaced and somewhat territorial. Elena knelt beside a section of wall where the metal plating kept shifting between solid matter and something that resembled crystallized mathematics. Think of them as cosmic squatters rather than vengeful spirits. Trade Coordinator Nixivel's ceremonial quills had arranged themselves into what Elena's cultural briefings probably hadn't covered, but which looked suspiciously like a pattern for warding off evil. Dr. Vasquez, with respect, that wall is currently exhibiting properties that violate at least 6 fundamental laws of physics. 7, actually. You missed the bit where it's aging backwards. Elena withdrew what appeared to be a handheld device that shouldn't have fit in her kit, but somehow had anyway. But physics violations are really just physics we haven't properly cataloged yet. My department maintains extensive databases on alternative physical constants. The device in her hands began emitting a low, thrumming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The air around Elena shimmered as reality reluctantly agreed to follow more conventional rules in her immediate vicinity. What is that thing? Hegemony Liaison Tormund demanded, his enhanced vocal cords producing harmonics that suggested either awe or the mechanical equivalent of prayer. Standard issue reality anchor. Every field agent carries one. Remarkably useful for maintaining local physical constants during negotiations with entities whose existence tends to make normal matter nervous. Elena adjusted a dial, and the device's humming shifted to a frequency that made the walls stop their enthusiastic attempts to exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Though I have to say, whoever's taken up residence here has remarkably good taste in manifestation aesthetics. A sound echoed through the corridor. Not quite a voice, not quite music, but definitely communication. It carried undertones of vast intelligence, cosmic loneliness, and what might have been irritation at being disturbed during what could charitably be called home renovation. Elena responded with a series of harmonic tones produced by a second device that looked like someone had crossed a tuning fork with a quantum computer. The exchange continued for several minutes, with Elena occasionally nodding as though the cosmic entity was making perfectly reasonable points about zoning regulations and noise complaints. "You're talking to it?" Ambassador Cathari whispered, her skin patches now cycling through colors that probably indicated either religious awakening or complete psychological breakdown. "Of course, standard first contact protocols. Most anomalous entities are quite reasonable once you establish proper communication channels." Elena paused in her harmonic conversation to address the group. Apparently, this particular individual has been trying to establish a dimensional nexus for interdimensional travel. Nexus Station's location made it an ideal candidate for development, but nobody bothered to file the proper environmental impact assessments. The cosmic entity produced another series of sounds that somehow conveyed both exasperation and wounded professional pride. Yes, I understand," Elena replied in her harmonic language. The paperwork requirements for cross-dimensional construction permits are absolutely ridiculous. But you can't just start reality modification projects without proper authorization. There are procedures. Commander Vexthul had reached the point where his multiple arms were cycling through gestures for several different types of surrender. Dr. Vasquez, are you suggesting that our supernatural manifestations are the result of unauthorized construction? Essentially, yes. Though unauthorized implies malicious intent, which doesn't seem to be the case here. Elena's device chimed pleasantly, and the corridor's geometry began settling into configurations that wouldn't require advanced mathematics to navigate. This entity has been trying to establish what amounts to an interdimensional highway rest stop. Nexus Station's position relative to several dimensional convergence points makes it prime real estate for that sort of development. And the incidents? The missing crew members, the impossible sounds, the equipment failures? Elena consulted her reality anchor's readouts with the casual efficiency of someone checking the weather. Construction accidents, mostly. Some noise complaints from existing residents. That would be you. A few cases of workers ending up in the wrong dimensional phase, but nothing that can't be resolved with proper safety protocols. The entity produced what was unmistakably a sigh that somehow managed to sound cosmic and deeply bureaucratic at the same time. I know, Elena said sympathetically. But if you'd filed the appropriate permits through the Galactic Cooperative's Anomalous Development Office, none of this would have been necessary. They could have worked out a joint use agreement with the station management. Trade Coordinator Nick Savell's quills had progressed through several complete emotional cycles and were now settling into a pattern that suggested grudging acceptance of a universe that was far stranger than anyone had prepared him for. There's an Anomalous Development Office? Oh, yes. Subdivision of my department. They handle zoning permits for non-Euclidean architecture, environmental impact assessments for reality modification projects, that sort of thing. Remarkably efficient once you learn to navigate the filing requirements. Elena's conversation with the entity continued for another few minutes before concluding with what sounded like mutual agreement and possibly an exchange of contact information. The corridor finished its transition back to normal three-dimensional space, though several sections of wall retained a faint shimmer that suggested reality was still processing the recent negotiations. So, Commander Vexthul said carefully, what happens now? Elena packed away her reality anchor with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully resolved a customer service issue without needing to escalate to management. Well, our interdimensional contractor here has agreed to suspend construction activities while I help them file the proper paperwork for legal development permits. In exchange, they'll relocate any accidentally displaced personnel and provide compensation for the inconvenience caused to station operations. Compensation. Standard rates for dimensional disturbance incidents should cover your maintenance costs and probably fund some significant infrastructure improvements. Elena shouldered her kit and headed back toward the main corridor with the brisk efficiency of someone whose workday was proceeding exactly according to schedule. Oh, and they're offering to provide interdimensional travel services once the proper permits are approved. Could be quite profitable for the station, actually. The group followed her back through corridors that had returned to sensible, three-dimensional configurations, each lost in their own contemplation of a universe where cosmic horror apparently filed paperwork and offered customer compensation for inconvenience caused. 3 hours later, Elena sat in Commander Vexthul's office, completing forms that shouldn't have existed in any rational bureaucracy. The Incident Resolution and Entity Relocation Report required signatures in 17 different inks, 3 of which existed only in theoretical space, and acknowledgement from parties that technically didn't inhabit the same dimension as the paperwork itself. Dr. Vasquez, Vexthul said, watching her fill out sections labeled things like ontological status of primary manifestation, and recommended dimensional permits for future construction. I have to ask, how exactly did your species develop expertise in this? Elena looked up from calculating interdimensional shipping costs for displaced crew members. You mean cosmic horror management? Honestly, Commander, it started with pest control. Humans have always been remarkably adaptable when it comes to dealing with things that want to eat us, drive us insane, or reorganize our living spaces according to impossible geometric principles. She returned to her paperwork, noting with professional satisfaction that the entity had agreed to cover all relocation expenses and provide a 20% discount on future dimensional engineering services. Once we developed faster-than-light travel, we discovered that the universe was absolutely crawling with phenomena that other species classified as impossible and tried to avoid. Human response was typically to study them, catalog their behavioral patterns, and develop management strategies. Management strategies. Well, yes. Take your basic elder entity. Vast intelligence, cosmic perspective, tendency to drive lesser beings mad through sheer exposure to their existence. Most species encounter something like that, and either worship it as a god or flee to the opposite end of the galaxy. Elena signed her name in ink that briefly existed in 7 dimensions before settling into standard 3-dimensional text. Humans ask if it's hiring. Ambassador Kethari, who had been silently processing the day's revelations while her skin patches slowly returned to normal chromatic patterns, finally spoke. You're suggesting that humanity treats cosmic horror as employment opportunities? Not exactly employment. More like consulting contracts with very specialized vendors. Elena sealed the completed forms in an envelope that folded itself into impossible configurations before vanishing entirely. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to find qualified contractors for projects involving non-Euclidean architecture, or entities capable of processing information across multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously? Turns out elder beings make excellent consultants for really complex engineering problems. Trade Coordinator Nixvel had been unusually quiet since returning from Section C, his ceremonial quills arranged in patterns that Elena's cultural briefings suggested indicated deep philosophical contemplation. Dr. Vasquez, you mentioned earlier that some entities require more direct intervention. What does that entail? Elena's expression shifted slightly, acquiring the kind of professional neutrality that suggested this particular topic came with disclaimers and probably required additional insurance coverage. Well, not every anomalous entity is interested in peaceful coexistence or mutually beneficial arrangements. Some are genuinely hostile, others are simply too alien to communicate with effectively, and a few are actively malicious. And then we move to termination protocols. The way Elena said this made the temperature in the room drop several degrees, despite no apparent change in the environmental systems. Though termination isn't quite accurate. You can't really kill something that exists outside conventional space-time. You can, however, relocate it to dimensions where its presence won't negatively impact local reality. We maintain several containment universes specifically for entities that can't be reasoned with. Hegemony Liaison. Tormund leaned forward with the kind of fascination that his diplomatic training probably discouraged. Containment universes? Oh yes, pocket dimensions designed to provide suitable environments for entities whose existence is incompatible with inhabited space. Think of them as specialized nature preserves for cosmic horror. Elena's smile returned, though it carried undertones that suggested the nature preserve analogy might be somewhat euphemistic. My department employs several teams of specialists whose job is essentially wildlife management for things that predate the concept of wildlife. Commander Vex Thule had reached the point where his multiple arms were performing completely different tasks, while his brain attempted to process information that challenged several fundamental assumptions about how the universe operated. Dr. Vasquez, are you telling me that humanity has essentially domesticated cosmic horror? Domesticated is a strong word, Commander. We've simply established working relationships with entities that other species consider existential threats. It's really just an extension of humanity's general approach to environmental challenges. Elena stood and shouldered her kit, which somehow seemed less ominous now that its contents had been revealed as cosmic customer service tools. We've been sharing our planet with things that could kill us in creative ways for hundreds of thousands of years. Once we reached the stars, we just continued that tradition on a galactic scale. But why? Ambassador Cathari's skin patches flickered, with what Elena was beginning to recognize as the chromatic equivalent of desperate curiosity. Why not simply avoid dangerous phenomena like sensible species do? Elena paused at the office door, considering the question with the serious attention it deserved. Because, Ambassador, if you spend your entire existence avoiding things that are bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than you are, you never actually accomplish anything interesting. Humans decided long ago that the universe is far too fascinating to experience from a safe distance. She activated her transport authorization with a device that briefly turned the air around her the color of mathematics. Besides, someone has to deal with cosmic horror, and it turns out we're surprisingly good at it. Better than anyone expected, really. As Elena departed Nexus Station, leaving behind a freshly signed interdimensional development contract and a crew of aliens who were still processing the revelation that humanity treated incomprehensible cosmic forces as service industry partners, something interesting happened in the lower levels. The entity that had been quietly terrorizing the station for months had completed its relocation to a designated construction zone in dimensional subspace, where it was now filing proper permit applications and reviewing human-designed safety protocols for interdimensional development projects. It had also submitted a formal application to join the Galactic Cooperative's registry of certified anomalous contractors. In its application essay, it noted with what might have been cosmic admiration that humans were the first species it had encountered who responded to existential terror with performance reviews and process improvement suggestions. Somewhere in the depths of space, an ancient entity older than most star systems was learning to appreciate the simple satisfaction of properly completed paperwork and the surprising effectiveness of customer service training. The universe, it reflected, had become a significantly more interesting place since humans had decided that impossible things simply needed better management.